Welcome to Satellite Stories, where we interview those who have encountered Jesus through video games and nerd culture. We're part of the LTN Podcast Network, and today we're going to hear another story. Hey, so here I am hanging out, ready to get going, and I've got Chris with me. Chris, how are you today, brother?
Man, it is a good day. It's a good day, Jamie. It's good to be here too.
Yeah, it is a good day. It is a good day. We were just talking about that. Like, you know, some days are good. Some days you just honestly want to be like, no, today's not good. It sucks. But I feel like today was good for me. Sounds like it's good for you. And man, so I know you, but some of our friends listening, they may have heard of you. I think we've mentioned you before. Maybe not. I don't know. It's probably good things. But go ahead and tell us a little bit about you, Chris. Who are you, man?
Yeah, you bet. So my name's Chris Skaggs. I'm outside of, I'm in Newberg, Oregon, which is a little bit south of Portland. And I'm the founder of Soma Games. We started on paper in 2005. Our first game was released in 2009, and we've been doing that ever since. So we've probably made about 400 games for different people. Like that wasn't all like under our name, but we did a lot of work for hire for whoever, Intel, MGM, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. So we've been doing this for a long time. And then I'm also, I guess, the founder of the Imladris community, which is a bunch of professional game developers who are also Christians. And so that's how we met. And here we are.
I love that. And I'm so glad that we have somewhat of a roadmap, because you just said like 30 things and I'm like, ooh, we should talk about that. We should talk about that. We can't talk about it all. So, all right, Chris. So everything you just said to me, I understand almost all of it, but I'm not a game developer. So you say things like all these companies, and I know Intel. I'm like, oh, that's computer people. But for those of you who know the gaming world, you're like, oh, this dude makes a lot of video games. That's rad. For those of you who don't, you're going to get to hear from somebody who actually makes the video games today. And hey, some good news. Chris has probably not made the games that you say are evil and bad and scary. But if video games just intimidate you all the way, then, well, I guess Chris will provide his email and you can send him some hate mail. It'll be no. So Chris is a great guy. Chris is so fun. And how we met is pretty cool. You mentioned this thing called Imladris. You mentioned it's for game developers. We'll probably talk about that a bit today. So tell me a little bit more about that, just briefly, and then kind of how we met.
Yeah, sure. So long story short is back in 2019. No, what year is it, for pity's sake? I think it was 2019.
What planet are we on?
In fact, now that I think about it, it had to be 2021, because I'm doing my math. Long story short, we were just towards the end of the COVID, and people were starting to come out of their shells. And then God one day asked me this weird question. He was like, hey, Chris, what if you were the king of the games industry? What would you do? And you don't get money and you don't get power. You just get authority and favor. So start there. And I'm like, that is a crazy question. That's just a weird way to put it.
Yeah.
But it got me thinking about some really different things. And so there's a whole long story there. There's a whole big website about it. But I wound up getting about a dozen friends together, kind of a dinner party. Like, hey, I've got some things on my mind I'd love to share. What do you think? And that was the first Imladris. Was like a dozen people, maybe 20, if you include plus ones. But that big idea was stemmed on a couple thoughts, which was better for worse, video games are the ascendant media industry. And depending on who you ask, it either already is the dominant medium or it's just about to be. And how Hollywood has handled that role for the last 100 years, they did some good things and they did some bad things. What could we do better? Like if we were to actually take 100-year view and say, what do we want the whole entertainment space to look like in 100 years? Like, what will our grandkids inherit? Where would we start? And use it with the kingdom of God in mind. And then that just like, it's a very broad topic, and it's not really about a game. It's about culture, and it's about an ecosystem for all the creatives. And that's what was the foundation of the Imladris idea. What we found instantly was these 12 people that I invited, all of us had really felt like this was God's call in our life, was to be in this industry. And all of us, to a person, had been deeply wounded by the church. Some version of like games are from the devil, or you're wasting your time and you're just like, you should be Protestant work ethic stuff, or Mark Driscoll, like even if games aren't sinful, they're stupid. Like just like all of us had been deeply wounded,
Yeah.
And we needed to know that we weren't alone. Like probably the one thing that we realized that Imladris started to provide was that notion, like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone. I didn't know that. I literally could tell you like a dozen, like off the top of my head, stories of people who flat out just start crying. They're like, I'm not alone. I'm not the only Christian here. And they lose their minds just to know that. And it's so beautiful, Jamie. I mean, I think that you've seen that probably at every, it started in 2020, I think. And then we've been doing those conferences every year, summer. And what's actually the last 6 months is it's just catching wind in a way where people are like, this is so necessary for the kingdom of God. I'm seeing, especially going back to the COVID, parents who had hated games and were always telling their kids, like, get outside, talk to your friends, go kick a football.
Yeah.
All of a sudden they had to sit down with their kid at Fortnite and
watch them play Fortnite.
I can't tell you.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I've got these parents who are like, my kid's got more friends than I do. I had no idea that they were socializing in these games. They just had no clue. And so I'm seeing these folks come back. It's like, I was wrong. I was wrong about this industry. I was wrong about this entertainment space, and we need to talk.
Yeah. Dude, so what I love about this story, one is I think you and I have both heard each other's like spiels. Like I could probably give the Imladris spiel. You could give the SG spiel. But every time I hear it, there's like other stuff that sticks out to me. And you're talking about parents sitting down watching their kids game because like we're all stuck in the house. Bonus point here. I think you're the only person I know that calls it the COVID, and it makes me laugh like every time. And you know it. You're like, it's so funny. So the COVID happened, and all these parents sit down, and that is kind of where I think both of our worlds, there was like obvious overlap. And the cool thing is, people listening, like, you may or may not know this. I live in Kaiser, which is like 30 minutes from Chris. And no, the only person who planned that was God. Chris has Imladris. I have Satellite Gaming. He Soma Games and Go Game. Like Oregon, I'm not kidding. It's this beautiful hot spot for video game industry. And I'm just like, amazing. Yeah. So without us knowing, COVID happened and our worlds are suddenly...
You mean the COVID?
What's that? The COVID. Oh, sorry.
You mean the COVID?
The COVID. The COVID happened, and we are now talking with parents about their kids playing video games. And now, Chris, you're talking about parents about their kids playing video games. They're suddenly realizing the importance of what you do, that's make video games, and the importance of what we do, that's play video games with kids. And oh my goodness, we could probably again make a whole series of podcasts about what that season did for the games industry. But the direction that I want to go now is just to chuckle and say the moment where we both really did come together and see that. I'll share the first part from my perspective, and then you take over. I was sent an email from somebody that had done video game ministry, had been doing it. It was Jeff from Crew. Know and love that dude. Have you met him in person yet?
Yeah, I think at your event.
Okay, that's right. It was at the showcase and the tournament last year. So Jeff sends me this thing, and he's like, "Hey man, this is like," and Jeff lives in Florida. Okay. He's like, "Hey, I'm seeing this thing called Imladris." I'm like, pretty sure that's Elvish. These are my people. And he's like, "Yeah. And it's in your state." And I was like, Silverton, that's like, I could throw a rock at Silverton. That's in my neighborhood, bro. What are you talking about? This is not. And he's like, honestly, at first I thought it was you guys because it's Oregon, but like, this is not you guys. It's like, no. What's funny is I remember that the first time I heard your name, I was like at Broadway Commons, a coffee shop, and someone mentioned you. They mentioned Redwall, and I'm like, oh, I know Redwall. I love Redwall. And yes, Soma made a video game out of Redwall. So if you knew what Redwall was, you didn't know there was a game. It's thanks to Chris and Soma. So I'm going, this is cool. And I think like back in the day, we text like maybe once. But again, we were both doing really cool things and both had a lot going on. Maybe we connected, maybe we didn't. But it wasn't until here where I realized like, yeah, I knew this was happening, but I didn't realize like the impact it was having, how big it was, the momentum. And I'm like, I'm going to register for this Imladris thing that's happening 30 minutes from my house. And as I'm filling out the registration, it's like 4 game developers. And I'm like, yeah, I love Jesus. I love games. I have RPG Maker. Like, let's just fill this out and see what happens. So, Chris, you get this inquiry from this dude, Jamie Harris. What happens on your end?
Yeah, so at that point, it's a little bit different now, but at that point, Imladris was invite only, and we were very deliberate. It was very early on, and like I wanted to know who was coming, right? Because we're trying to curate this community, and all of a sudden, this stranger pops up, and I'm like, who are you? Like, how did you even get this invite, right? And I think at first I was a little bit worried that you were a troll of some kind. Like what if this guy is, he's causing trouble? But one a couple emails where I'm like, all right, well, like God's will, right? If that's the way God wants it.
That's
and
crazy.
I think what was fun is I remember being at the event and I had a little bit of a sailor's mouth, so I previous Navy, and at some point you came up to me as I have a beer in my hand, and you're like, you say the dirty words out loud and you drink beer, you're my friend. Introduced yourself.
Anybody
like, wow,
that's listening that knows me, they're like, sounds about right. Oh, that's amazing.
And I got to tell you, Jamie, so you also, like, one, that was a fantastic way to meet. And it was so clear that God was like, yeah, I planned this, right? Like, it's like you said, that was
Amen.
it was totally God's plan. But I think on top of that, you started introducing me to an idea that, I hate to say this, but I just had not thought about it, which was whatever we were trying to do with Imladris, we had not considered the players. Like, I was so focused on the developers because that's the world I come from. I had not even thought about what happens next. And frankly, in hindsight, it's so stupid because all of us make these games for people to play them, right? Like, this isn't like a hard thing, but I just hadn't thought about it. Like, and none of us had thought of it. Like, all of us are like, and there's this long-standing story. And this is probably all game developers. Like, yeah, I'm sure that we need to be marketed, but I'll get to that later. And they don't. Right. Yeah. So like actually getting it to the people, advertising, selling, like we just don't cross our minds, often because we're busy. Like, that's one stupid idea. Often because we're broke, because everything, like, we spend all our money on debt. We forget to have a marketing budget. But I think also most of us are shy. And at some level, like the idea of reaching out to actual human beings who may not like you and who don't like your game, that feels risky. And so anyways, working with you is like, this whole thing about we just have to engage in a mutually respectful, good way with the players. Now it's like so obvious. I can't believe that I missed it.
Well, to throw that back at you, I'm sitting here playing games and then realizing when I think of like Christians and video games, I think of Christian video games, and I think of Christian video games that feel like Christian movies, and I'm like, why would I ever want my kid to play that? Like, right. And here's the thing: there are Christian movies that I've seen that like really touch me, and there are a lot, especially for like my kid, right? Like, there's like VeggieTale is a great example of like, I still have my daughter watch VeggieTale, and it's so much easier to explain Joshua and Jericho when peas are throwing slushies at cucumbers than it is like, hey, so a lot of people died, honey. She's like no, there's some great opportunities there. Then when I hear the idea of like, oh no, we're Christians and we work and want to influence the video game industry from inside of it rather than outside of it and throwing rocks at it, I'm like, that's where I had never thought. So I think for both of us, it was this moment where it's like, holy cow. And this is where I got to say, I think, you use the word like, he was so stupid. This is where I've got to say I was humbled because it's almost like, I feel at times like I'm thinking of things like that other people aren't thinking. I'm like, how is it not obvious we should be doing video game ministry? There are 3 billion people playing them. And I just go, how is this not obvious? And then I'm realizing like, it's also pretty obvious that we need Christians working for video game companies like Riot and Blizzard and Activision. And then I go, why didn't I think of that? So it humbles me because it's not easy to think of things that might be obvious to someone else. I think part of that is because of God's call in our life, right? I'm called to reach players. Yeah. You're called to reach game developers. And there might be somebody that's listening that's called to pastor a church. But I think it's important they know that there are people doing things with gamers. There are people doing things with developers. And I love that God called us both to the same world, but to reach different people in it. And now we get to cheer each other on in how we do that. So the direction I'm going to take this now is it's not just me. there are a lot of people in this Imladris movement, this culture, and I love it. And inviting you to be on this podcast, part of what we shared before and earlier was I really want to put the microscope on a couple moments where you got to see, or maybe one, but let's have a conversation about a time where you saw the magnifying glass. Just zoom in on a person who experienced Jesus, video games, and their life was changed by it, or they had a moment in their life where like video games and Jesus, it's just like this explosion of the Holy Spirit in their heart, and they're like, this is working. And that is what I want people to hear. So let's grab that magnifying glass and zoom in on Imladris and tell me about a story, man.
Yeah. There's a couple that I would love to tell. I think for the sake of my community, often these people work in places where their faith is a little bit secret. Like for better or for worse, they may not want to be outed. So if you'll allow me to kind of like hide the names.
Please. I love that. That's part of the heart of this. Yeah.
So this is just a year ago. So this is actually a pretty fresh story. I met a guy who was the head of a big gaming conglomerate. They had $1 billion of funds every year to make.
Wait, say that again. You cut out a little bit. You had what?
So it's a guy who was the head of a big game making conglomerate. So he had about $1 billion worth of funds every year to spend on this stuff.
Wow.
And he's making like $100 million decisions. It's just nuts. But he had spent his whole career thinking he was the only game maker in the whole space. Right? He just didn't realize. So I ran into him last year, and it was an introduction, friend of a friend kind of stuff. And he was so excited. He's like, "Oh my gosh, I met another gamer!" And I'm like, "Dude, let me introduce you to literally 1,000." Right? So this is the Imladris community. He's like, "It's not me. It's all of these people." And he lost his mind. So he starts like tearing up and crying. He's like, "I'm not alone," right? So he just suddenly realizes there's something really big going on here. That by itself was incredible, just moment of healing and everything else. But here's what happened next: is a couple months later he gets a new job, and so he leaves that job to become the head of a project that probably won't launch for another 4 or 5 years.
Oh my
but it's going to be one of the biggest video games that's out there.
Chris, I have to interrupt you. One, it's kind of good timing, bad timing. Your mic's cutting out a little bit, but also my daughter somehow got into my room. So I need to go lock the door, and praise Jesus, I get my office back in a week and a half. 1 second.
Okay, so here's a story that's only about a year old. So this is actually pretty fresh, but it's got a fun like kind of intro story and then a follow up. So I met this cat who was the leader of a huge game making studio. And he had about $1 billion every year to spend on games. Like he's legit making $100 million decisions every month. And he'd been in the industry for, I don't know, 20 years or so. But he always thought he was the only Christian that he knew in the whole industry. And this is a guy like with lots of power and influence and contacts. And so like, you got to understand, this isn't some like low guy. But he just always thought he was alone. And as a result, he thought that the only way that he could realistically be Christian in the space, so to speak, was basically be nice to people. And that's good. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing.
And
like,
that's what probably not even share about his faith, right? Just like hunker down and be quiet about it. Like,
exactly.
Yeah. Ugh.
Yeah. And so that like lifestyle evangelism kind of a thing. So he gets introduced to me and from a friend of a friend, and he first realizes, oh my gosh, like there's another Christian in the industry. Now, of course, I'm a small indie shop. I don't have $1 billion. I don't have $1 million. I have like literally 3 orders of magnitude below this guy. But he was just so excited to meet a friend. And I'm like, dude, like it's not just me. I need to introduce 1,000 other believers in this space. And he lost his mind, Jamie. Like the look on his face was like waking up to the sunshine. He'd like, he started crying. He started to cry, and someone just to tears up to be that sense that all of a sudden he saw there was a whole world that he was not aware of. So it was beautiful, like just moment of like validation and like you're in the right place and you're not alone, like huge restoration for him. But then it gets even better because probably 4 or 5 months later, he takes a new job. And in this one, now he's now the leader of a project this won't launch for probably another 4 or 5 years, but it's going to be one of the big giant games, like probably $200 million budget, like giant game. You'll hear it, the studio. But he picked up the lead on that project, and now he comes back to our community, to me and a couple other people, and like, I want to know what else we can do. I have this role, I have this, frankly, like, authority. Like, what can I do besides being good to people, which is good, but what else? And all of them, he's open to conversations about the content of the game, and it can start at the most subtle level. So I'm like, look, this game is set in a United States like 50 years from now, right?
Okay.
He's like, yes. So it's like, are there any churches in the game? Which is to say, like, just you could pass that you don't even have to walk into them, but they're just in the background. It's like, no, we never even thought of that, because in their world, like this dystopian future thing, is like, I just never thought of churches. I'm like, but that doesn't make any sense. Like there's no such thing as an America without churches.
Yeah.
And he's like, you're right. I hadn't even considered it. Like, now, if you want to go the next level, just make them, you can walk in there, right? Just a few places that, there don't even have to be any people in there. Just so you have thousands of other empty buildings that you can walk in and store your gear and make a save point. Like, just make a church. Yeah. He's like, maybe I legit never considered this. I'm like, are there, sure, right? Maybe there's whatever, mutant rats or something. And then you're like, just go to the next level. Are there any Christians? For that matter, are there any religious people at all in your world? They don't have to be NPC. They don't have to be major players. Just, do they even exist? And they're not like stupid cartoon characters and villains, but are they just normal people? Because there's no such thing as an America that doesn't have Christians. And for that matter, there's no such thing as a world that doesn't have religious people, like Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus, like, you name it. Like, something like 80% of the world is religious, and depending on who you ask, 95%. Like, there's no such thing. And he just never thought about that. And all of a sudden he's like, I can make these changes. And it becomes this subtle thing where it's like, to imagine like this massive world, and as a player, you're walking through it, and just things like the existence of a spiritual understanding is now an assumption, instead of the kind of like, without being assumed, is the like, there's no spiritual world, there's no spiritual people, there's no good people, certainly not good people who are spiritual. And all of a sudden you've just shifted that assumption. And it goes back when C.S. Lewis says, we don't need more Christian books. We need more books by Christians in every discipline, who just leave Christianity as the assumption of their work, where their Christianity is latent. It's like, that same idea is so important here. And so here's this guy's like, I just blows his mind. And I'm seeing him kind of work through this, like, what's the possibilities here?
That is so cool, man. And I want to make sure too that this gets said, because we had some mic issues, but it is important that when we tell stories, we don't want to be like in the clouds saying like, well, this is unrelatable. Who is this? The reason, maybe, again, you said already, but I want to emphasize the reason we're not like just saying who this is, what game this is, because like we want to make sure they can stay protected in the way they do this work. Yeah. And truthfully, as I listen to this, like what you're talking about is actually not even bad for the game. If anything, it's better for the game itself, because it makes it more real. It makes it more authentic. Yes. It's not just this, oh, I've got this agenda of saying something. It's like, no, we want to have a presence. And I'm speaking on behalf of game designers here, as again, so do you farts around on RPG Maker, but to have a presence and to have a voice in these spaces and say things, this is where I think it's so special, Chris, is because the more guys we have like this person that you're talking about, and the more guys we have like you, when I pull up a video game and suddenly there's a church there and I'm playing with a student, that opens up a conversation to be like, oh, that looks like the church I grew up in, man. I bet the church I grew up in would have zombies in it. Like that's totally, that's it. Like, or like those deep cobwebs that were there for like 50 years and no one ever cleaned them. Some crazy arachnid is going to crawl out of that hole. I promise you. Like, so this journey of you working with game developers, us working with gamers, and there's so much more. You have this cool pathway that you guys are working on communicating in the Imladris community. This pathway creates more opportunities for stories like we've heard in previous podcast episodes. So like at Satellite Gaming, like the second episode I think of Satellite Stories was the story of Nathan. And knowing that there are guys like you, this other person you spoke about, I think it creates more opportunities and it empowers us as ministers to the gamers to make more stories like Nathan's happen. To just know that there's somebody that is praying over this game that my students play every single day, that maybe there's some games that have questionable content, but to know that there's somebody behind the scenes that is like faithfully praying, like, Lord, my hope and prayer is that as somebody plays this game, they encounter you. And man, I think that is powerful. It's one thing for me to pray as somebody who doesn't know the gaming space, but for somebody like you who works on them, who knows them, knows the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into them, to be able to say along with those blood, sweat, and tears, a little bit of prayer, a lot of prayer in a lot of cases.
Exactly.
Powerful, man. So again, I kind of went into this episode a little different. I kind of gave you free reign. Like, you got one story, you got 10 stories, you got, I think because of the uniqueness of what you do, there's no end to the stories you could share. And I think that's a massive blessing, but let's talk for a second about that relationship and that pathway of, like, person who loves Jesus, likes video games. A person who loves Jesus has many options. Are they going to pick up and play a Christian game? Are they going to play a game created by people who love Jesus? Are they going to play a game that's made by a company like Blizzard, who has gotten a lot of flack, but might have somebody in that space that can influence the game just a little bit, you know? So where do you see really our paths crossing, and what could happen if people really catch wind of this, if pastors understand what we're doing, if moms and grandmas and parents and dads catch wind of what's happening here? Like, why do we want people to, like, buy into what we're doing? Like, why is that important? What if they listen to this and they go, okay, that's a thing. Like, what part can they play?
So there's a short answer and a long answer. Let me go for medium. Like, as I've worked with this industry, it's matured in the technology. So since I started, like, in 2005 on paper, the technology and the techniques have improved a lot. And one of the results of that is that games are now like a legit art form, where probably before 2005-ish, they were really a technology that had some artistic elements. But you've got games now that are so beautifully artistic, so moving, that we have to think of them in the ways that we would think about movies and books and music. Okay, so like, one of my big things is, like, understanding games as an art form. When we do that, we have to also consider that art in the church has always been a little bit hinky, not always, in the last 100 years, maybe since the Reformation. Dorothy Sayers likes to say that the church has never made up its mind about the arts. And part of that is the church's fault, I think, for not really recognizing that God talks about beauty in ways that, like, this is one of the transcendental values of creation. Like, it's not a means to an end. It's not something just sort of like tertiary. Like, this is a big deal. When Plato talks about, like, the good and the beautiful and the true as the transcendentals, and of course Aristotle picks that up, like, the church really does not know what to do with beauty, and that's the church's fault. But it's also, I think, us as artists, it's our fault, is that we have not been good at articulating our value and, frankly, standing on it. And so when I also think about when there's Christians who say, for example, are maybe more committed to their faith, and this is a good thing, this is not a criticism, but they're like, if I have in my art, I'm going to choose my faith. If they're that person,
if you have to choose between faith and art, you're going to choose your faith.
So I'm thinking of those people. Some of them, something I love is the stories. I'm like, that's a false binary. That's not the choice, because I'm looking at another story just from yesterday of a guy who saw a video that I did monthly, probably a year ago, and his mind was blown. He's like, I never knew that I could just be creative and make a video game and not have to make it like David and Goliath. He just had never thought. So all of a sudden, like, all this creativity is released. It's like we need so much creativity and art for the world, not just for the church. Like we don't need to, frankly, like, we don't need games to preach. We need art to move hearts, right? And so this idea of, like, when we understand games as an art form, then things like comedy and satire and social criticism, like, all these become totally valid expressions. And then things like doctrinal teaching becomes, like, one of many possible things you can do, but it's not like you're not limited to that. And you probably understand that same conversation with musicians. Like, the church, if it doesn't have a place for good musicians, that's not only worship musicians. And there's no place for them to make records, or there's no place for them to go on tour. That doesn't make any sense. So of course these people, so when you think about like who's the most influential Christian in music, if you don't think Bono, like you're not paying attention.
So true, bro. So true. Yeah. Yeah. And for those who don't know the music side of it, like Bono he's part of like one of the largest secular bands ever.
Ever.
It's not a Christian band. They were the first to play at the Sphere, right? In LA, weren't they? And they put a big giant cross on there. Something that Bubba from Love Thy Nerd says, I love it. He says, one of the greatest Christian movies of all time, Book of Elijah. Or Book of Eli, right?
Book of Eli, like, yeah.
That's so true. Like the dude memorized the entire Bible. Like that's a Christian movie. Get out of here. And no, that's so good. Continue, but yes, you're talking about that in the video game realm. That needs to happen. Like it needs to happen.
And sometimes people say like Christians don't make good video games. Like there's this notion like they all make crap. I'm like, okay, pause and think about your definition, because did you know that Sid Meier, Civilization, one of the most successful video games ever, total believer? Did you know that Rabbit and Rand Miller? Yeah. So the guys who made Myst, that for decades was the most successful game ever, they were literally like leading worship in Spokane while they were making the game. Club Penguin is probably, I don't think it's anymore, but it was one of the most successful MMOs ever. Lance Creed,
No way.
Yeah.
I know. I mean, yeah, everyone knows. All my students know Club Penguin. That's ridiculous.
Trip Hawkins and Dave Evans, the founders of EA, and then David Gardner, all Christians.
Yep.
And so like these are like the cream of the crop. And if you just understand what was like, if you just change your definition, all of a sudden you're like, oh, these are some of the best people, best products, best companies in the whole space.
Yeah.
That's encouraging.
So
I find that so encouraging.
Oh, it's so encouraging. And I think that I think this is where I want to bring this to head and say, this is why I have you on the Satellite Stories podcast, because I really want people to know when our kids are playing video games, look, if the fight that you want to fight is that video games are bad and they should stop, that's a really strongly going train downhill very fast. If you wanted to stop video games from happening, sorry, it's too late. It's happening. So you're not going to stop that. So if your fight is, we need to stop video games, good luck, Godspeed. The fight that Chris and I and others in this community are trying to fight is that we need people that love Jesus on that train desperately.
Yes.
Desperately. And that is not just for us, but you mentioned our grandkids. That is for my grandkids. Oh my goodness, I talk on a very small scale, not a 100-year scale, on a 15-year scale. You don't want your 5-year-old to play Fortnite? Okay, I get that. You don't want your 10-year-old to play Fortnite? I don't know. You don't want your 15-year-old to play Fortnite? I'm telling you, when the dude's 18, goes to live off on his own, he's going to play Fortnite. And guess what? Nobody taught him how to do that responsibly. What's going to happen? That's that's terrifying to me. So when we even look at this on a 10-year scale, if we are not present in that, man, the people on that train are desperately in trouble if they haven't had people come alongside of them and coach them and teach them. So where we're coming in at Satellite Gaming is, you may not like it, but somebody's got to be in there with these kids. And where you are in helping people work for these large games like EA and these large companies like EA and Riot and whoever, man, if we're not there and we're not present, then what? Like, I can't, for me, it's again, this obvious thing of like, it has to be there. So if I could summarize that and say, to parents, let me just say to parents or people that care about kids, period. They need us there now, and they need seeds that are being planted that will be reaped 100 years from now. I think I say it pretty regularly. I think if we are not present, outside of the complete grace of God, we lose an entire generation to a digital age, like period.
Yes.
So Chris, man, it's so good to hang out with you. Man, there's so much that could be said. I'm excited for the next Imladris. Like, I'm excited that, we've been able to be a more hands-on part of it because we are here locally, and that's a huge blessing. But I think the demographic that maybe we haven't spoken about yet, and I think I want to close with this. We've talked a little bit about parents, about Christians, about maybe pastors. What about the people that do not know Jesus, that might want to see video games being used for good? Man, what is some hope that you can give them, that we're not just trying to come in and like put a cross on every single video? We're not just trying to come in and ruin the art. You talk about art, right? How are these followers of Jesus Christ looking to really enhance the quality of the art that is the video games industry, without imposing, but maybe, yes, opening the door to some conversations? What would you say to people that listen that don't know Jesus and maybe don't care?
Yeah. So I think that now make sure I clarify this.
Yeah.
You said people who are in that space, but also want to see games for good. Is that correct?
They want to know that, like, hey, we care about video games. We care that they're going to be used for good, but why are you guys trying to get all the Jesus stuff? You know what I mean? Like how do you reassure them, like, hey bro, I actually think what I have to bring is going to enhance the quality of this. We touched on a little bit with the previous story, but just share something there.
Yeah, so I think that you have the same question, like what counts as art for good. And so if you're willing to, for the moment, just understand like where does art do good? And I think that it does, its best role is always to ask the really deep questions, and without trying to offer didactic answers. So good art really rings us up to like, what are the deeper transcendental things that are going on in our lives? And which is to say, like, what matters? What does it mean to live the good life? Like, how do we make a difference in the world? And those things are things that Christians ought to be like profoundly interested in. And even if in the end, even if they're like I want to feed the poor because I love Jesus, like even if you strip that out, feeding the poor is a good thing. We agree. Even if I want to, take the lid off of like, what does sex trafficking, like, how does this work and how can we defeat it? Doesn't really matter at that point if they're motivated by Jesus or atheism or something else. Like, we can agree that's a good thing. And so when we can find the questions of like the ways in which art moves hearts in a way that magnifies policy and choices, right? So the reason I think that art works is it gets underneath our mental barriers. Instead of us, like, we always have the things that we've thought about and things that we've justified and rationalized. Art gets underneath that down to our hearts, and that's its best place, I think. And you don't have to agree with every precept of Christianity, or for that matter, with any precept of Christianity, to think like there's a common good that probably not everybody, but almost everybody agrees on. It's human flourishing, it's health, it's safety, it's prosperity. Like, these are things that we all love. So when art can bring people to examine that at a deeper level, man, we all win. We all win. That's what in Christian circles we call it the common grace. We call that this kind of like the flourishing of all humanity. Like, that's not liberalism. That's not doctrine. That's just loving people.
I love that so much, Chris, and I think the final thing that I want to communicate is if I can't speak on behalf of people that don't know Jesus, because I walk with Jesus, but I do work with and serve a lot of people that don't know Jesus and kind of don't care about Jesus. But if they are able to, and I hope they do, to hear about the way you talk about video games as an art form, and you really care for that art form, and you really want to enhance that and have it speak to their heart in just good, true, and beautiful ways. I'm grateful that you're doing that, and I think they probably appreciate that. So thank you for that. And man, Chris, as long as you guys keep doing what you're doing, it just sets up guys like me and Bubba and Brandon from Slingshot. It's all these people that are doing video game ministry. As long as you keep doing what you're doing, it just gives us so many more opportunities for satellite stories, so many more opportunities for seeing the Holy Spirit intersect with people's hearts through video games. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for the movement that you're building, that you're a part of. And thanks for being my friend, bro. It's just good to shoot the breeze and talk stories, man. So much love to to you and everyone for listening. Thanks. Hey, make sure, you know what? Hey, I don't know. This might be appropriate. Tell me real quick, this will be the last plug for everyone to do. That background behind you is art. It is beautiful. People just need to know, what is that and what can they do? And we'll end with that.
Yeah, so that is a background from our game that literally we just got approved today, and so it'll go live tomorrow. It's called The Reluctant Redemption of Verity Lux, and it is an interactive fiction game set in a world where it's like, what if Blade Runner and Noah's Ark had a Nephilim baby? And it's one of my favorite stories we've ever written. It's got like supernatural and demons and sex trafficking. Like, there's all kinds of this heavy stuff. So it's not for kids, but I think it's one of the best stories we've ever written. So that goes live on Steam tomorrow.
That is beautiful. I will make sure people have a link to that. And y'all, thank you so much. Please go check out Verity Lux. Chris, once again, much love, brother.
Thanks, bud.
Thanks for joining us as we grow the library of satellite stories. We'll see you next time. And don't forget, Jesus loves you, nerds.